the land that emits a deep green hue, Shashya Shyamala, for the crop stands so thick. A verse from our national song celebrating India's fertility and great crop diversity. It is believed that at one time, India had more than 400,000 varieties of rice, enough to feed a man a new kind every day for his lifetime and for 500 years after that. Farmers of past generations harnessed this great diversity to feed themselves and the growing Indian population. But 4 decades ago, the danger of a great famine changed the way food production and agriculture was seen. A failed monsoon and the resulting fear of large-scale starvation sent panic waves through the nation. A belief that only the explosive yields of some imported miracle seeds would save the country from this crisis led the decision makers to throw caution to the wind. Little did they know that these seeds were accompanied by a retinue of synergistic chemical fertilizers and pesticides without which the promised yields could never be achieved. The traditional varieties were forsaken and a new breed of high-yielding crops were released to swamp the nation's fields. This was the birth of the Green Revolution, and it was hoped that this would save the country from a great disaster. The hybrids performed well, and the remarkable yields in the first few years spurred a complete changeover. The traditional varieties slowly faded into the background. But in less than a decade, the hybrid bubble burst. Yields plateaued, though the inputs of fertilizers and pesticides were constantly increasing. Many of the hybrid crops failed in adverse conditions, and most had little resistance against pests. The farmers found themselves caught in an endless spiral of increased chemical use, decreasing yields, and a deteriorating environment. Some wanted to go back to traditional agriculture. But by then, the worst had already happened. Many of the traditional varieties had already vanished, and those that survived were lost among the minute handkerchief farms spread out over vast areas. For a revival to happen, these lost seeds had to be found and then brought back to life on the chemical-soaked fields. This is the story of a project that began a revolution of a new kind. Countless crop cycles and a changing generation had faded the memories of traditional agriculture. But some farmers still harbored the hopes of reviving the traditional paddy varieties. At the Center for Indian Knowledge Systems, we had been working with the farmers of Valayampattu for almost a year, training them on the methods of organic farming. We were documenting indigenous agricultural systems in Tamil Nadu, and the Valayampattu village was a core study area. Some of the farmers used this opportunity to speak of their desire to revive indigenous crop varieties. And during the course of this discussion, the farmers and all of us present realized that we had converged in our ideas of reviving traditional agriculture. At this point, the first seeds of the Biodiversity Conservation Project were sown. We at the center were only too happy to find an ally among the farmers. Here was a chance to put our ideas into action. After a series of discussions, about 30 farmers resolved to set aside a portion of their lands to cultivate indigenous crops. These would be cultivated only using organic inputs and no synthetic chemicals at all. And it would be ensured that the harvested seeds reached other people who were interested in growing these traditional varieties. On their own initiative, the farmers produced a framework and defined the roles of all those involved. These farmers became the core members of the project and came to be called the Seed Keepers. The center played the role of a silent catalyst, watching and ensuring the smooth progress of the planning stages. We were there to light the flame. It was left to the farmers, however, to build a fire that would light up a great revival effort. The first task of the project was seed collection, and this was a big hill to climb. None of the farmers in Valayampattu had indigenous seeds in quantities that were required for large-scale cultivation. Most had nothing more than a handful to offer. The centre approached government seed banks to see if they could help. Unfortunately, the seed banks only maintained seeds for long-term preservation, and they too had little to offer. The only other option was to seek out farmers who still cultivated the traditional varieties. This was a task simpler said than done. Such farmers were few and far between, and most of them worked at very small scales. Their whereabouts were unknown. An expedition was undertaken to locate such farmers, to speak about this project and then persuade them to give some grains. A team of seed seekers travelled to different parts of Tamil Nadu in what was a landmark effort in crop conservation. At a time when the land was swamped with hybrid monocultures, looking for traditional varieties was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. The seekers had to search down farmers, mostly following clues given by word of mouth. Many of the clues were just dead ends. After 6 frustrating months and meetings with hundreds of farmers, 8 rice varieties were found. Some were given in goodwill and some had to be bought. These precious seeds became the source pool for many of the varieties in the future. Information about the characteristics of each of these seeds was also gathered from the farmers. This was done because the indigenous varieties had their own personalities, the knowledge of which could be useful for other cultivators. For example, Samba Mosanam, a South Indian variety, was well adapted to growing in waterlogged areas. It was ideal for lands that were close to large water bodies and prone to waterlogging.